One of the ideas we've been looking at in detail on this channel is this idea of moral courage. And that's because as a society and as a culture, we seem to have lost any conception of what this virtue actually entails. In this era when people tweet their stunning and brave support for LGBT stuff and Black Lives Matter, these people think that they are showing great virtue. But in fact, because there is no social risk entailed here, there is no virtue on display at all. In fact, what you are actually seeing is more likely to be moral cowardice and opportunism. Moral courage is the courage to take action for moral reasons despite the risk of adverse consequences. Courage is required to take action when one has doubts or fears about the consequences. Moral courage, therefore, involves deliberation or careful thought. Reflex action or dogmatic fanaticism do not involve moral courage because such impulsive actions are not based upon moral reasoning. Moral courage may also require physical courage when the consequences are punishment or other bodily peril. And it's funny, even in this definition in Wikipedia, they include becoming an ally for LGBT. Now ask yourself, is there any risk involved in taking that position? Do you take any social risk? Do you take any risk at, say, keeping your job? Whether perhaps it is moral, perhaps it's not, that's a discussion you can have. But really what you see if you question that as more reflex action and dogmatic fanaticism than rational, reasoned arguments. Real moral courage is something entirely different. Whether you're looking at the tank man that stood up to the Chinese communists, or Constantinus Caducus, who rather than raise the German flag over the Acropolis in World War II, took his own flag, wrapped it around himself, and leapt to his death in protest. Or even in our modern time, in more humorous fashion, the police officer that stood up to LeBron James' horrific call for violence against those that just don't look like him, in the shape of a good-natured and yet very serious in subject matter video response. And congratulations, at last look, that cop had raised over $500,000. And so keeping with this theme of highlighting displays of moral courage, I want to go back into history and look at the impact that one human being can have that refuses to keep their mouth shut, that refuses to do what they know is wrong, that swims against the current and follows their conscience. And of course, sometimes they end up paying the ultimate price, but the fruits of that sacrifice can echo down through the ages. This is the story of Saint Telemachus. Now we're all familiar with the Roman Colosseum and the gladiatorial games that occurred there. It was a massive structure that could hold somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people at a time. And there, people and animals were slaughtered for entertainment. For over 400 years, there was routine executions, duels to the death, and battle reenactments, mostly with slaves and condemned criminals. It's estimated that somewhere between 400,000 people or more died within the walls of this amphitheater. This is roughly 1,000 deaths per year of mostly marginalized people or those looked down on by the upper classes. And it wasn't only humans. It's estimated that over 1 million animals died during the history of the gladiatorial games. They hunted and killed wild animals for the plebs, or people that would never see such creatures. In fact, the extermination was so extensive, it's believed that entire species were wiped out of the Mediterranean and North African environments. Animals that were considered exotic at the time were included, but weren't limited to, rabbits, crocodiles, elephants, leopards, bears, tigers, hippopotamuses, wild goats, boars, dogs, lions, and deer. In one extraordinary example of the violence that was common in the Colosseum, the Emperor Commodus once killed 100 lions in a single day. Later, he decapitated a running ostrich and carried its head over to the senator's seating area and motioned as if they were next. He also killed 3 elephants on the arena floor by himself, and even several giraffes, which oddly the Roman people found quite disgusting due to the fact it was viewed as a helpless animal. And this began to change as Christianity began to seep into the moral fiber of the Roman population. And that, coupled with the courage of one man, finally put an end to this horrible institution. So I want to read you a selection of this book called The Byzantine Empire by Sir Charles William Chadwick Oman to provide greater context of this event. It is not till 40 years after Constantine's death that we find the Christian spirit fully penetrating out of the spiritual into the material sphere of life. The old gladiatorial shows, one of the most characteristic and repulsive features of Roman life, were abolished not long after. They survived for 60 years at Rome, though Christian Constantinople never knew them. But this was not the work of the state, but of a single individual. One day in AD 404, the games had begun, and the gladiators were about to engage, when the monk Telemachus leapt down into the arena and threw himself between the combatants, adjuring them not to slay their brethren. There was an angry scuffle, and the good monk was slain. But his death had the effect that his protests might have failed to bring about, and no gladiatorial show was ever given again. In other provinces of social life, the work of Christianity was no less marked. It put an end to the detestable practice of infanticide which pervaded the ancient world, resting on the assumption that the father had the right to decide whether or not he would rear the child he had begotten. Constantine made the state assume the charge of feeding and rearing the children of the destitute, lest their parents should be tempted to cast them forth to perish in the old fashion. And Valentinian, in 374, assimilated infanticide to other forms of murder, and made it a capital offense. Slavery was also profoundly affected by the teaching of the Church. The ancient world, save a few philosophers, had regarded the slave with such contempt that he was hardly reckoned a moral being or conceived to have rights or virtues. Christianity taught that he was a man with an immortal soul, no less than his own master, and bade slaves and freemen to meet on terms of perfect equality around the baptismal font and before the sacred table. It was from the first taught that the man who freed his slaves earned the approval of heaven, and all occasions of rejoicing, public and private, were fitly commemorated by the liberation of deserving individuals. Though slavery was not extinguished for centuries, its evils were immensely modified. Justinian's legislation shows that by his time, public opinion had condemned the characteristic evils of ancient slavery. He permitted the intermarriage of slaves and free persons, stipulating only for the consent of the owner of the servile partner in the wedlock. He declared the children of such mixed marriages free, and he made the prostitution of a slave by a master a criminal offense. Hereditary slavery became almost unknown, and the institution was only kept up by the introduction of barbarian captives, heathens, and enemies, whose position did not appeal so keenly to the mind of their captors. The improvement of the condition of all the unhappy classes of which we have been speaking, women, infants, slaves, gladiators, can be directly traced back to a single fundamental Christian truth. It was the belief in the importance of the individual human soul in the eyes of God that led the converted Roman to realize his responsibility and change his attitude towards the helpless beings whom he had before despised and neglected. And so we can see, going back to our original definition of moral courage, it was the deliberative and careful thought of the Roman population on the implications of their newly accepted Christian theology, coupled with the moral courage of one particular individual, which led to the abolition of the practice of slaughtering human beings for entertainment. After being apprised of the circumstance, the admirable Christian Emperor Honorius, son of Christian Emperor Theodosius I, numbered Telemachus with the victorious martyrs and abolished the gladiatorial games.
This power of prayer can be illustrated by a story that goes back to the 4th century. The Asian monk living in a little remote village, spending most of his time in prayer or tending the garden from which he obtained his sustenance. I hesitate to say the name because I'm not sure I know the pronunciation, but let me take a chance. It was Telemachus back in the 4th century. And then one day he thought he heard the voice of God telling him to go to Rome. And believing that he had heard, he set out. And weeks later, he arrived there, having traveled most of the way on foot. And it was at a time of a festival in Rome. They were celebrating a triumph over the Goths. And he followed a crowd into the Colosseum. And then there in the midst of this great crowd, he saw the gladiators come forth, stand before the emperor and say, "We who are about to die salute you." And he realized they were going to fight to the death for the entertainment of the crowd. And he cried out, "In the name of Christ, stop." And his voice was lost in the tumult there in the great Colosseum. And as the games began, he made his way down through the crowd and climbed over the wall and dropped to the floor of the arena. And suddenly the crowd saw this scrawny little figure making his way out to the gladiators and saying over and over again, "In the name of Christ, stop." And they thought it was part of the entertainment, and at first they were amused. But then when they realized it wasn't, they grew belligerent and angry. And as he was pleading with the gladiators, "In the name of Christ, stop," one of them plunged his sword into his body. And as he fell to the sand of the arena in death, his last words were, "In the name of Christ, stop." And suddenly a strange thing happened. The gladiators stood looking at this tiny form lying in the sand. A silence fell over the Colosseum. And then someplace up in the upper tiers, an individual made his way to an exit and left, and others began to follow. And in the dead silence, everyone left the Colosseum. That was the last battle to the death between gladiators in the Roman Colosseum. Never again did anyone kill, or did men kill each other for the entertainment of the crowd. One tiny voice that could hardly be heard above the tumult. "In the name of Christ, stop." It is something we could be saying to each other throughout the world today.